Welcome to everyone who is joining us today during UK Black History Month. I am Maxine Albert, Deputy Head of Diversity and Inclusion for the House of Commons Service, and we are delighted to have been asked by the team behind the Sam Sharpe Project to host the 9th Annual Sam Sharpe Lecture. As an employer, we are working to improve the diversity of our workforce, but also to ensure that we create a culture where people feel valued and included and can thrive. Therefore, we are grateful for the support of one of Parliament's workplace equality networks, Parley Reach, focusing on race, ethnicity and cultural heritage in hosting the Sam Sharpe Lecture today. We know that we still have much to do, but we are working harder to achieve racial equity. For those who are not aware of the story of Sam Sharpe, he was born a slave in Jamaica and orchestrated a national uprising in his fight for freedom and justice for enslaved people, costing him his life. His death and the revolt that took place in Jamaica played a role in the parliamentary deliberations and ultimately the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. His story and the fight for justice continues to be relevant today as we recognise the existence and the impact of modern slavery that is found particularly in supply chains in the UK and across the world. Earlier this year, Parliament published its modern slavery statement, declaring our commitment to tackling modern slavery. Our intention is to ensure that it has no place in the House of Commons, our contracts, or our supply chains, and our support for the government's objectives to eradicate modern slavery and human trafficking. A special mention goes out to Jennifer Crook, the Director of Operations in In-House Services, her team, and the working group for the work that they continue to do in this area. So I am pleased to welcome the Sam Sharpe Project to the House of Commons and would like to introduce Eleasah Louis, an associate of the Sam Sharpe Project, who will be our chair for this evening.
Thank you so much, Maxine, for introducing me. I'm very pleased to be here among such incredible people and to contribute to what promises to be a stimulating lecture and direction and guide for action. So I'm an associate of the Sam Sharpe Project, and I work in academic roles as a researcher, a consultant, and resource developer for Christian organizations and churches that seek to engage with decolonization, reparations, and anti-racism. My role today is, of course, to introduce our esteemed speaker, an inspiration, and later to facilitate the question and answer segment of tonight's proceedings. Please send your questions into the comment box and I'll do my best to get through as many as possible. So tonight, I am honored to introduce to you Amanda Khozi Mukwashi.
Good evening. Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you very much to the Sam Sharpe Project for inviting me to be counted among those who have delivered this lecture before me. I hope that I'll be able to do the Sam Sharpe Project Justice, but also Sam Sharpe himself. I have not come to lecture Black people about the state of our captivity, nor have I come to lecture white people on the state of their privilege. Rather, I'm hoping that I have come to call for racial justice as a key first step to social, climate, and economic justice and freedom. Racism is an ideology that has been used for centuries to shape the relationships between Black people and people of other skin color across the world. An ideology that has defined who is human and who is subhuman, whose knowledge is valued and whose is not, and whose lives matter and whose do not. Racism, for me, is a belief system that has influenced policies. It has shaped structures and strengthened the evolution of a capitalist system that has centralized power and wealth in the hands of one social group at the expense of another. This ideology must be dismantled. In the words of Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, in his address to the United Nations in 1963, until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, close quotes, there will be no justice, no freedom, and no human rights. These words remind us a resistance against the union of power and discrimination has been an ancient struggle. For example, the biblical story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego tells us, in the midst of flames and fire, these men refused to bow down to idols. Instead, they resisted and remained faithful to their knowledge of who God is. The racial flames today support an ideology that perpetuates a system in which Black bodies have lower status and are ranked at the bottom end of society. It is an ideology that must be permanently discredited and abandoned. This year's Sam Sharpe Lecture is being hosted by the Workplace Equality Network's Parallel Reach from the House of Commons. Thank you. This is very welcome. Parliament, the heart and symbol of British democracy, where the voices and freedoms of every British person are guaranteed without fear or favor. However, it is not every British person that enjoys the benefits from these freedoms, and not every British voice that is heard. Black people have a different experience. Please note that while I speak of the Black experience in this lecture, we must remain aware of the diversities in the Black experience. Black people all experience subjugation and oppression, and while that is a common thread in their experiences of the relationship with empire, not all have the history of the transatlantic slave trade. Nevertheless, the systems, the structures, the policies, and the values that started with slavery have progressively been consolidated to keep the poorest and the most vulnerable in the chains of poverty and injustice. The majority of these people are Black and brown people. We are still not free. We must forge the path to freedom and be clear as to what will define our generation as our unique contribution to the liberation of Black people. And it is here I want to offer some suggestions on how perhaps we build on the legacies of those who have gone before us and disrupt the systematic norms until change comes. The racialization of capitalism is a system that must end. But first, let us go back together in history and remember the giants who have made it possible for us to be having these conversations this evening in this context. And so it is 2021. Slavery was abolished in the 1800s, and political independence was gained by former colonies in the 1900s. Sojourner Truth and those who came after her struggled for the liberation of Black Africans who were incarcerated in open prisons, otherwise known as plantations. Many whose names must be called, lest we forget their sacrifice, died trying to pave the way to freedom. Names, some of which will never be known or heard of because they simply disappeared and are still missing in action. The tombstones that must be erected in every country, in those countries that participated in the transatlantic slave trade, and in those countries whose people were taken and or sold into slavery, must stand tall with no names but the words, they paved the way to freedom. We need those tombstones. One, as a reminder of the sacrifice that was made for us to be free. Two, as a warning to generations to come that we have walked this path before and there's only one place it leads to, and that place is not life. And third, three, as a baton for us to run the next stage of the race and to do so with grace and with humility. Many years ago, I was working for the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. A young graduate, I was full of excitement and dreams of a vibrant African continent. I went to Ghana for a meeting that was organized by the Third World Network, where we were discussing trade liberalization and the unfair trade rules that impacted on African farmers and other businesses. During my stay in Accra, I had the opportunity to visit Cape Coast Castle. There I found the door of no return, a symbol of pain where those captured would walk through to board the ships that would tear them away from everything they knew and take them to a place where who they were, what their identity was, would be destroyed forever. That is, if they survived the journey. What is known is that millions of people were taken and millions more died on the way. For over 300 years, white Europeans, driven by a belief that Africans were subhuman, created a system that treated humans of a different skin color as less than wild animals. From Britain, ships left the ports of Liverpool, Bristol, and Glasgow to trade in human life, making their owners wealthy and through the labor of the slaves, contributing to the prosperity of the British public purse, one of the wealthiest public purses in the world today. The battle for freedom from enslavement would be long and it would be hard and many lives would be lost. Eventually, the transatlantic slave trade was banned. When the roll is names of those who struggled for freedom be called. Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, they searched for freedom. Mary Prince, Otoba Kogwano, Oladu Ekwano, Phyllis Whitley, and countless other Black abolitionists whose names and stories are not mentioned, campaigned for the end of slavery. The immoral nature of the business eventually permeated through to enough people in power and to influencers who then stood together with the Black abolitionists and forced the end of the slave trade. Two key things to note, and these are really important things for me. Following the banning of slavery, former slave owners and their descendants were compensated to such an extent that British taxpayers only finished paying this off less than 10 years ago. I want to repeat that. Following the banning of slavery, former slave owners and their descendants were compensated to such an extent that British taxpayers only finished paying this off less than 10 years ago. And secondly, most Christian denominations supported the slave trade. Some, like the Quakers and the Church of England, held slaves and financially profited from the trade at some point in their history. The church was against the abolishing of slavery. Just in case we forget and find ourselves being on the wrong side of justice once again in our lifetime, it is important to remember those facts. With the abolishment of slavery, we had passed through another door of no return, even though slavery continued for years after Britain abolished it, including in British colonies. Sadly, slavery still continues to this day. The door of no return must become a symbol and a reminder for us that never again must we allow our humanity and birthright of freedom to be traded in the public square of capitalism and greed. We owe it to ourselves, to those who have gone, and to those who are yet to come. I left Cape Coast Castle in tears and determined that one day I too would be counted among those who searched for and stood up for justice and freedom. But freedom would come in bits, never freely given, always fought for. First, they came to take the people away. Then, when trading in human life was no longer acceptable, they came for those left at home. They came for the land. They came for the resources that lay therein. So while I'm not of the generation that lived under the bonds of colonialism, I was born close enough as part of the post-independence generation who heard the stories firsthand from those who lived through it. Stories of not being allowed in the same church building as white believers and having to stand outside to listen to the word of God. Stories of being treated as subhuman in one's own home. While the shackles had been removed from those who had been transported to the US and the West Indies, those chains had simply been transferred to those who remained on the continent of Africa. Gold, God, and glory. The story of colonialism was not just about gold, but as aptly and vividly portrayed in Danai Gurira's The Convert, it was a story of religious, cultural, and linguistic colonialism too. In just 100 years, the continent would be stripped of what remained of its wealth, its spiritual foundations, along with its material possessions, its people subjugated and oppressed at home. Or at least, that is what the colonizing powers attempted to do, and they succeeded to a large extent. But as we have learned over generations, a lesson I would urge all of us that we must never forget to pass on to our children is that even when in chains, our spirit and resilience was not and must never be completely crushed. Traditional warriors, pastoralists, farmers, and women fought against the Italians and were successful after 5 years of struggle. Ethiopia was never colonized, despite the Italians having a narrative that teaches otherwise. As a cradle of civilization, their spirit and resilience won the day. As the Apostle says, as the Apostle Paul says in his second letter to the Corinthians, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted but not abandoned, struck down but not destroyed, new freedom fighters would emerge. Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, Kenneth Kaunda, and many others learned from and leveraged the gains of the anti-slavery movement and fought for political freedom of colonized countries. While slavery physically removed people from all they knew and transported them across the oceans, colonialism made Black Africans prisoners in their own homeland. The story of the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible bears some interesting parallels to the plight that the people of Africa found themselves in following the abolition of the slave trade. Captives in their own land, they had no say, they had no power, no authority over their land, resources, not even their personhood. Even their knowledge of who they were and their heritage was discredited. The wave of independence from colonial rule in Africa brought with it self-rule. The fact that self-rule was based on the colonizers' rules of engagement and that the benchmark of what was good and acceptable was also based on the colonizer as a symbol of what is right, good, and ideal, and is a problem that continues to hold us captive to this day. Key to that is the work of the missionaries and the education systems they set up to convert people to Christianity. The role of the church, once again, in using religion as a tool of oppression that served those with power and wealth, must not be glazed over or rationalized as anything but. Instead, there must be acknowledgement of wrongs committed. Forgiveness must be sought. Restoration is a sine qua non for reconciliation. Lessons must be learned. Political independence did not come with economic freedom, nor indeed with mental freedom. Gold now solidly resided in the coffers of the West, and their museums were now home to cultural and religious artifacts deemed evil by Western missionaries, but happily providing a source of income and entertainment. Unsure of our footing, our identity was in flux. What did it mean to be a Black African? Were our traditions really evil and primitive? Our traditional practices were relegated to customary law to be administered by local courts, and yet the question must be asked, what is English common law if not a set of agreed traditions, practices, and behaviors? We were not free. As Bob Marley, the Jamaican reggae musician, urged us, we needed to free ourselves from mental slavery, even as we walked through yet another door of no return to reclaim our identity, our freedom, and our dignity. And so continue walking with me. I hope you don't fall asleep. As the world moved from slavery to colonialism and then to modern day systems, namely neocolonialism, it is important to explore the question of whether these systems were dismantled as new ones came into effect. So, for example, when slavery was abolished, were the structures of power dismantled to allow those who had been oppressed to take their rightful place in the cycle of power and decision-making? Were global financial systems restructured to create a fair and level playing field for international trade and competition? To this end, were new and just financial redistribution systems set up to compensate and to restore to those who had been oppressed, whose labor had been exploited, and whose bodies dehumanized. In short, were the structures that thrived under the slave systems tackled in order to level up? Or did the colonial system simply build on the previous systems, on the previous structures and resources to create a world that looked different, maybe felt different, but essentially remained the same at heart? The core engine of the colonial system, the principles and the values that drove that system and ensured that it succeeded, were all still very much based on exploitation of Black people wherever they were. Africa, the Caribbean, the US, the UK, and indeed wherever you find them today. So while colonial administration eventually came to an end, captivity did not. When Africans took over leadership, they took over economies that were set up to serve the needs of former colonial economies. To quote one student from the University of Tennessee, open quote, European powers pursued this goal by encouraging the development of a commodity-based trading system, a cash crop agriculture system, and by building a trade network linking the total economic output of a region to the demands of the colonizing state. The development of colonialism and the partition of Africa by the European colonial powers arrested the natural development of the African economic system, close quotes. A trend, I'm afraid to say, that has come back in full force through Chinese investment in many developing countries. But that is a conversation for another day. The global trading system, the regulations around taxation, for example, are decided by the most powerful nations to serve their economies. The legacy of colonialism has therefore taken hold with deep roots in all areas of human life. It ensures that the slave master and the colonizer, one and the same, still have power over Black nations and their wealth-creating systems, still have a hold over Black knowledge, over what is valued, still determine how much we are worth as a people, still refuse to effect reparations for lives and resources lost, still hold Black lives as inconsequential, Black pain as meaningless, and Black personhood as second class. George Floyd. Maldonado Torres, a South American colonial theorist, explains this in a different way and uses the concept of coloniality to highlight the impact of colonialism. I quote, "Coloniality is different from colonialism. Colonialism denotes a political and economic relations in which sovereignty of a nation or a people rests on the power of another nation, which makes such a nation an empire. Coloniality instead refers to the long-standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism and slavery, but that define culture, labor, intersubjectivity relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administrations. Coloniality outlives colonization. It is maintained alive in books, in the criteria of academic performance, culture patterns, even in common sense, in the self-image of people, in aspirations of self, and so many other aspects of our modern experience. In a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. Slavery as well as colonialism, are both prequel systems to coloniality. Those systems have continued to be refined over time so that they have the appearance of being good, of being fair, and not based on race. But the reality is that the economic systems that exist today are still very much the same ones that made slavery and colonialism flourish. And until those structures and systems are completely dismantled and changed, Black people will remain in captivity. Captive to economic systems that are hardwired from generations back to keep us in poverty and without equal and fair access to opportunities. Captive to social systems that in this very country, here in the UK, tell us that the benchmark of what is good, what is right, and what is desired is white. Social systems that are based on single source knowledge that has been passed on from generation to generation. Social systems, including religion, that continues to imply through actions that Black people are an inferior group of people and deserving of equal consideration as their white counterparts. The history of liberation movements would suggest to us that we must find ways to free ourselves from this captivity and forge pathways to freedom. We need a level playing field. And that means that somewhere else, there has to be a giving up of resources. That somewhere else, there has to be a giving up of power, the blindness and ignorance, and there has to be giving up of space. We must build on the gains of those who have gone before to fight for freedom. But ours is an increasingly difficult task because just as we must build on the gains that have been made, let us remember that the current capitalist system is also built on the blood of the millions that have died trying to search after freedom and dignity. And it thrives on that basis. And yet we must do two things: dismantle the system of oppression at the same time as we build a system that upholds the dignity of every human being, regardless of color, one that is just and that will ensure generations to come can exist and thrive within planetary boundaries. The refusal by those who govern to engage with conversations on decolonization, reparations, and the institutionalization of racism is disappointing at best and irresponsible and short-sighted at worst. This denial is absolutely not different to those who for the last so many years have been in denial about the existence of the true nature of climate change, for example, believing instead that humanity can recklessly consume the abundance of the planet without consequence. That those who have benefited the most from climate change, just like those who benefited the most from slavery, from colonialism, and ongoing capitalism, are somehow exempt from a duty and responsibility to champion the leveling up that is a must happen in this country and globally and in this generation. To compensate, to pay back, to invest, or to restore, frankly speaking, I'm not too concerned about the words here. It is the outcome that I'm interested in. We need the conversation to move from a battle of definitions to a reality of actions. We need physical freedom. We need political freedom, economic freedom, social and spiritual freedom. Only then can we say there has been true emancipation and leveling up for everybody all around. In the last year, some of the superficial varnish that covers the structures, the mechanisms, and the systems of power and wealth have been removed. And we have seen the ugly face of a global system of apartheid. At least if you've been looking and paying attention, one that has graded human beings according to the color of their skin and given them a value. The events that have unfolded in the last 18 months leave no one in any doubt as to what value Black and brown people are given in the bigger scheme of economics. The death of George Floyd in the United States of America, a very public and blatant abuse of privilege, shocked many of us. Despite this not being the first time such violence has been meted out to Black people in the US, it was nevertheless very shocking and sent a chill of fear into all of us. While in the US, it was the death by the hand of a public official that shocked. Here in the UK, we were waking up to the reality that Black and brown people were more likely to die of COVID than any other group. That Black and brown people sat at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder and the system did not seem to be too concerned. The denial by the report on racism produced by Number 10 that there was no institutional racism in the UK, together with the support for the bowing of those taking the knee by the leadership, was an extremely low moment in the history of civilized 21st century Britain. But I think it is fair to say it has been the management of the vaccine distribution that has removed all doubt. In a recent article, Kevin Watkins, former CEO of Save the Children UK, writes, and I quote, "Although science and industry have given us the means to immunize the world, 9 months after the first arm was jabbed with the COVID-19 vaccine, rich countries are using their market power to direct doses away from poor countries, placing millions of lives at risk. Consider some recent actions by the European Union," his article goes on to say. "Under a contract with Johnson & Johnson, the bloc has imported billions of vaccine doses from a company in South Africa, a country where a mere 11% of the population is vaccinated, and the Delta variant is fueling a surge in cases. Yet efforts to divert vaccine exports from Europe to South Africa and its neighbors were met with a display of vaccine gunboat diplomacy, with the EU threatening to take action under a clause in the Johnson & Johnson contract prohibiting export restrictions." End quote. And while it is difficult for the EU to see Africa and Africans as deserving of consideration and vaccinations, it is easy for the UK to find enough vaccines to trade with Australia and commit millions of vaccines. The economic structures and systems that the Western world relies on to maintain power and wealth are supported by the proceeds of the three pillars of slavery, colonialism, and capitalism. It can be argued that capitalism has been the accompanying ideology and common thread that has helped to crystallize racism. As part of its own logic of accumulation, capitalism racialized people to map ideas of property and ownership. For slavery and colonialism did more than take life and resources. It destroyed the personhood of the Black individual and collective. It removed the contents and filled the person with information that was meant to steal, kill, and destroy. It has held Black people in bondage, and I would argue to this day. Knowledge that came through generations of lived experiences, wisdom that built on ancient knowledge that safeguarded planetary life and identity, were deemed as evil, pagan, and primitive, repugnant to natural justice. The yardstick of what was right and good became white, and ever since, we have been chasing our tails, trying to achieve whiteness and everything it stands for. We measure our beauty against whiteness. We measure our success against Western benchmarks of success. Our books sustain this captivity racism places us in by centering white Western voices, stories, and experiences. The history of Africa, for example, is only ever told as starting from the arrival of Europeans. The criteria for academic performance sustain this captivity by demanding that children growing up in former British colonies be more proficient in English than their own mother tongue, to be able to have better academic and social prospects. Another 100 years, and the face of language in Africa and everything that is conveyed through it will be completely lost. Cultural patterns also sustain this captivity through the language we use for who is an immigrant and who is an expat. What do these things tell us about who and what is important? What implications does this have on the path we are to forge towards freedom today? We plan development and measure progress against Western standards, even when it is becoming increasingly clearer that Western development is not the answer that is fit for purpose, as it is founded on the destruction of both people and planet. Still, we are hardwired to turn a blind eye to the evident and very real faults of an oppressive system. All we have to do is to look at what is happening with the climate crisis. As people and planet are plundered, Black people around the world are the trampling ground for both. We must create wide spaces to walk through. No more doors. How do we forge the path ahead? How do we forge the path ahead? The question, I guess, is what must we do to level the playing field, to break the bonds that keep us out of opportunities, that stop us from being in the running and prevent us from having life and having it in its fullness as we are promised in Scripture? How do we honor those who have lost their lives for our freedom? Those who didn't make it across the fields? What have we learned along the way? What type of strategies are required to throw off the 21st century shackles now? And what batons are we passing on to the next generation, such as the 3 lions? These are rhetorical questions we continue to ask ourselves as we reflect every day on how we continue in this struggle. The answer cannot be provided by one voice alone, but in our collective and our shared vision of change. Today, we celebrate the Sam Sharpe story as a story of liberation, of resilience, activism, and of faith. While there are many stories of courage and resilience, such as Sam Sharpe or Harriet Tubman and others, our trauma remains as we remember over 1.5 million Black bodies suffered during the Middle Passage and remain missing in action. But my question to you as you listen to this is, How many Black bodies are missing in action today? And how do we, like Sam Sharpe, keep forging ahead and building new pathways for the generations to come? Most African and Caribbean populations living in the diaspora have, for the most part, developed a level of resilience so as to survive. For example, think of the Black footballers in the England squad. Every generation has left a legacy behind. For those who fought slavery, they focused on physical freedom. Those who challenged colonialism were looking for political independence. For our generation, we too must ask ourselves what our legacy will be. This is really important. Just like those who have traveled this road before us, we need to pick our game changer. The battleground for our investments, our thinking, our knowledge, our efforts, our emotions. What is our game changer? There are many things that we can all do to improve the situation. Policies, legislation, economics, education, rights, so many. But what will be our slavery was abolished or we gained political independence moment? What will define our generation as our unique contribution to the freedom of Black people? Can we build a new house on the same foundation as the old one while we're trying to dismantle it? Just think through that. Many of you might have heard that I call Coventry home. There are two cathedrals in Coventry that stand side by side. One is a ruin that remained from the Second World War when it was bombed. Coventry was flattened, and this cathedral was almost completely crushed. Bits of the walls of the cathedral remained standing, and the cross that stood where the altar must have been still stands to this day. Next to this burnt down cathedral, a new one has been built. A modern building that now attracts visitors from all around the world. A symbol of peace and reconciliation. What was damaged and what is new. Perhaps we too must build a new society that is founded on the Human Rights Declaration, where all people enjoy the same rights and freedoms, and where every human being is created in the image of God and deserving of dignity. It can be done. It really can be done. It requires freedom from both Black and white. Because ultimately, we are all in captivity. So to do this, we must create opportunities for ourselves in this generation and for generations to come. Our battleground is opportunity. Opportunity to free ourselves from economic and social bondage. Opportunity that celebrates Black talents, values that at par with white talent in all disciplines and innovation, and then rewards it in equal measure. And so allow me to make some final suggestions where I see these opportunities. One, the opportunity for everyone to do their duty and responsibility. Every leader, every parent, every citizen, to ensure that we create a space where freedom and justice reign. Change comes through struggle, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and keep hope alive are slogans and chants of the 1960s civil rights movements, chanted to remind the membership to march forward in the face of discrimination and unjust legal systems. We too struggle for what is just. We must continue to struggle for what is just. That is how we honor the lives that have gone before us. That is how we pave the way for those coming behind. We march and we stand together. The Black Lives Matter protests that took place across the world last year were different in that they were not only about Blackness. The protests were about justice. Images of young people from all walks of life, different skin color, holding banners and marching side by side, defied the notion that this is a Black people fight only. Black Lives Matter was a clear message. We cannot sit and watch while some houses on the streets burn to ashes because of a system that we have created. In the same way, we cannot sit and do nothing while climate change caused by our actions impacts on the most vulnerable in many countries and threatens their very existence. We must do this together. We must deliberately walk away from individualism of opportunities and instead collectivize our struggles for justice, dignity, and equality. This time round, we must either walk through the door of no return together or create wider spaces for us to walk through. We need, therefore, to be, as Black people, to be better represented in public life, in public policy mechanisms. For example, since the publication of the Stephen Lawrence Inquiry Report, there have been numerous initiatives, policy and guidance documents published aimed at improving performance across and within the criminal justice system. Some progresses have been made, but as we have seen over the last few months, there is still much more that needs to happen to eliminate institutional racism. Number two, the opportunity to restore that which has been buried, knowledge. And I have a particular, very strong feelings and emotions around this. In my book, But Where Are You Really From?, I belabor the point on identity and the different elements that make me who I am. The knowledge of my ancestors is really important to me. They are all equally important and create and contribute to my personhood. We must not be afraid to place our education systems, and for those like me who work in development and the humanitarian sector, to inform our understanding with the information and knowledge that comes from different sources, taught in different ways, and placing different interpretations in the cradle of learning. As we acquire new knowledges, we must be mindful that these new knowledges are subject to the same burying processes that prioritize certain types of knowledge from particular places and geographies. And therefore, locating the practices and systems that bury that knowledge is key to changing it and forging a path to true knowledge. Only then can we claim to be knowledgeable and educated. For now, I'm afraid, those who claim to be the echelons of education systems are simply the repositories of one worldview, a very limited understanding of the world indeed. Ranking of education institutions should be based on more than this. Rather, we must look to those whose insecurities do not stand in the way of true learning. The notion that Europeans came to Africa, the notion that before Europeans came to Africa, Black people were uncivilized would be laughable, but for the untold damage it has done to the Earth's inhabitants. Knowledge has been buried and must be exhumed and restored for all to learn from, unlearn and relearn. All, everyone. Then we can begin to create the white spaces to work on. 3, the opportunity to forgive, to repent, to restore, and to reconcile. For any people who have been at the receiving end of wrongdoing, the path to peace requires forgiveness, repentance, and restoration, and it is that leads to reconciliation. The continued denial of successive British governments to engage with the dark past of the British Empire, the refusal to acknowledge the merciless plundering and looting of resources and causing of loss of millions of lives, is to perpetuate the abhorrent notion of Black people as subhuman. We can learn from what has been done before. In September 1951, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, actually, of West Germany, addressed his parliament. I quote, "Unspeakable crimes have been committed in the name of the German people, calling for moral and material indemnity. The federal government are prepared, jointly with representatives of the State of Israel, to bring about a solution of the material indemnity problem, thus easing the way to the spiritual settlement of infinite suffering." Let me read that sentence back. To bring about a solution of the material indemnity problem, thus easing the way to the spiritual settlement of infinite suffering. I want to tell you today, abhorrent crimes against humanity were committed against Black people in Africa, the US, the UK, the Caribbean, the suffering of which continues to this day. Matthew, a disciple of Jesus Christ, writes of a story that Jesus told of the servant who had taken from his master. The servant not only apologized, but committed to restore that which had been taken. Perhaps that example does not sit well with those who might question that the British Empire was not a servant. Well then, the tax collector asks Jesus what he must do regarding all those whom he has robbed. And Jesus responds and asks him to restore fourfold. Financial restitution must be made to the nations whose people were traded, whose resources were plundered and destroyed. This will not heal the broken spirit of nations. It will be a key step to forging the path to freedom and dignity for all. Not only Black people, but all people. We need to create the opportunity to forgive, to repent, to restore, and to reconcile. All of creation needs it. Our continued failure to see this is destroying our planet and everything and everyone in it. My last point on the opportunity is number 4, is the opportunity to proclaim freedom for the captives. Isaiah 61 verse 1 and Luke 4 verse 18. Christians speak about the work of Christ, but a gap remains in living out the teaching and the actions of Christ. Too often, churches have been silent and complicit. Let me tell you, this hurts. Christianity has been shaped by the assumptions of a religion that has propped up empire. What is required of us is a need to call out and reject the gospel of Caesar, parading as the gospel of Jesus. We are called to be prophetic and proactive on issues of justice and reconciliation. For Black Christians, I say this to you. Scripture records those who were born in bondage in Egypt. did not get to the promised land, but generations after did. It was those in bondage who took the first step. Each generation must take its first step. If faith matters, then Christianity has to make sense to me as a Black African, in my context, and in my space, and in my language. We need, therefore, free ourselves from what Christian Aid has called an unquenchable thirst, a spirit of greed, and a character of instant gratification, with no thought for the future. Seek the peace of the land and reject a framing that focuses on accessing unlimited resources, which in turn is connected to global capitalism and a discourse that supports exploitation of people, land, and services. In conclusion, let me leave you with this message. One thing that climate change and the COVID pandemic have both shown the world today, if we're paying attention, it is that we are in captivity as humanity. We are in an escape room, and each group or section of society holds different clues. Not all of them, just different clues that need to be used together if we are to get out alive, all of us. The continued meting of injustice on the most vulnerable, on Black people, and on those most marginalized is not sustainable and will ultimately lead to the destruction of the world as we know it. As we close, allow me to give thanks for Sam Sharpe passing the baton of freedom to our generation. Let us not become weary of doing good, for at the proper time, we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Galatians 6, verse 9. Allow me also to urge us all not to let the struggles and the gains of those who have gone before us be for naught. But with love, faith, and hope, let us persevere in our pursuit for freedom. The prophet Isaiah says in chapter 61, verse 1, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings to the meek. He has sent me to bind the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound. Be free." Thank you, and good evening.
Absolutely incredible. Thank you so much, Amanda, for such a rich and stimulating lecture. I have so many points that I want to spend time processing properly. You've covered trade, modern day slavery, the COVID pandemic, the climate crisis, police brutality, our historical giants, church complicity, and grounded it all in the need for action, grounding our need for action in 4 biblical principles: repentance, forgiveness, restoration, and reconciliation. Frantz Fanon speaks of decolonization being inevitably violent. And here today, you've considered society, nations, hearts, minds, and theology. Often, the silence we meet, the refusal to comment or to play down our struggle for ethnic equality, is violence in this struggle. I think it's particularly important the way you consider the difference between colonialism and coloniality. The first being about power, commerce, nation. The second about patterns, the patterns and power that define culture, labor, knowledge, the trajectories, their boundaries and limitations. Sometimes people cannot see how they are complicit if they do not consider their individual social position as powerful. But the legacy you speak of and the gatekeeping you speak of does not always require this high social position. One can be complicit in their failure to interrogate the norms, as you've said, to ask questions, to question themselves and their sure knowledge. So can you speak more about how educational systems can broaden their knowledge streams, rediscovering, or as you said, exhuming this buried knowledge? How is this buried knowledge affecting our progress towards forgiveness, repentance, restoration, and reconciliation?
Thank you so much. I shall try and give some answers as I can, and where I don't have, I will tell you that I don't have. I'm not an education specialist. However, one of the things that I have considered personally, especially when I was writing my book, was the importance of the knowledge that I received about my personhood. Was a key determinant to how I see myself today, the aspirations that I have, and I guess maybe the value that I place on myself. And in that way, there's no monetary value that you can place on me because I'm bigger than that. And that comes from the knowledge of not just who my ancestors were, but the fact that they were considered people. They had a heritage. They had a form of worship. They had some economic systems. And they contributed to the struggles of different societies. And when you come to this country, and when you read and study 20th century history, and if the only thing that you read is that you come from a people who could not fight back, you come from a people who had no courage, you come from a people who had no knowledge, everything that they stood for was primitive, it was pagan, it was bad, right? You're bound to internalize that. That is one. Secondly, it is not an accurate account of historical facts. It's simple as, right? And in a world where we're talking about freedom of information and knowledge, we need to put all the different pieces of knowledge at the table for our young people to assess, analyze, get to know, and develop a respect for diversity and difference, right? Because diversity and difference is not a threat to us, right? It is the future. It is the future of our world, right? So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but for me, I've really struggled at times following the resistance, for example, that it's not about changing our history books, it's about adding to our history books. It's about bringing in other accounts of other perspectives. If I give an example of a bit of a toxic subject, when the history books are written about Brexit, for example, I'm sure when you read the German account or the French account, it's going to be very different from the British account. And even the British account is going to be very different depending on whether you were a Remainer or you were a Brexiteer, right? And all those are not going to be inaccurate in themselves, but there'll be different perspectives of what happened, of the rationale, the justification. And they're important for civilized 21st century society to be able to look at them and learn from them. The same way with the story of Black people, the story of different Asian communities, the story of Latin America. It's so critical that when we are looking at the history, for example, of Great Britain, that, let's have all the pieces together. Let's have all the truths as we see them, different perspectives, right? Including a gendered approach to the truth, because men's stories are going to be different from the perspective from women's stories. So for me, I guess maybe what I'm trying to say is, let's not be afraid of knowledge, right? Let's not be afraid of knowledge. Let's bring the knowledge into our schools. Let knowledge be celebrated, right? Let that diversity permeate our different thinking and styles of growing and evolving, right? Then we will find solutions for some of the global challenges that we have, like the climate crisis. Because if we had taken time to listen to the islanders in the Pacific Islands, to indigenous communities in the Amazons and in other parts of the world, maybe we would have avoided some of the challenges and the problems that we're in and that we're facing today.
Thank you. We've got quite a few questions coming in. So I'm going to do my best to work through them and try to get them coherent with each other. So someone from Bearwood Baptist Church says, is the oppression today due to racial prejudice or economics? This is important to define before prescribing solutions.
I had hoped that I had tried to communicate that for Black people, you can't separate the two. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, if we choose to start the story of Black people at a point of, let's say, the early 1900s, right? Or mid 1900s. Let's talk about the mid 1900s. Then yes, you can start talking about economics, and you can say, you know, it is the situation is as a result of economics. Mm-hmm. But what I'm trying to say is that the economics, the world economic order, the way it operates was set up. The genesis of that goes back to slavery, mm-hmm. right? So while we can't blame everything on 1455 or 1500 or 1600, what has happened is that the systems that those building blocks, right, that were set up then have evolved and mutated to become the capitalist system that we see now, that we accept now, right? So I can't separate the two. And I think the solutions, therefore, cannot simply look at the economic situation blindly and divorce that from what has happened in the past. The solutions have to be both in terms of the financial systems, the quick wins, taxation. What can we do about taxation? But in order for us to have that sustainable solution, we also need to look at the economic, the relationships, racism, the colonial issues. Coloniality is also primarily about the relationship that has emerged, the power dynamics, wealth creation. How are you going to redistribute wealth? It's not just about economics. It's about who is worthy and who is deserving and the relationship that exists between the two.
Thank you. So Paul Davis asks, at the level, well, he states, at the level of church, we need mutual accountability beyond dialogue. So I guess this is about our theology. So the European church is accountable to the African church for its action and theology. This should be an example for the world. What do you think this accountability could look like?
Oof, Paul, that's a really, really big question, probably bigger than me, to be honest. Whenever I'm dealing with things like this, I go back as a Christian, as a person of faith. I go back to the pathway that and the example of Jesus Christ, right? And I think that accountability has to go beyond just truth and reconciliation. I talk about this when I give the example of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, that, while that took place, right? why is South Africa still in the situation that it is, with the Black community really struggling at the bottom of the food chain? Because actually there was no restitution, there was no healing, right? So for me, in terms of that mutual accountability, rests upon the path to healing. If there's brokenness, that path to healing that says, there were wrongs that were committed, call out and name those wrongs, realize when you look at the church as it is now, that its wealth is partially as a result of those wrongs. So you can't just say, sorry, things went bad, and I'm going to keep what I have, but now how can we forgive each other? It doesn't work like that. Christ is very clear, right? In the example that I've given. So a conversation around what restoration looks like is really important. Knowing that restoration and restitution will need necessarily to go beyond the finances. It's not just about money. Money is an important, but a small part of it. It's the knowledge that everything that the Black church stood for, that everything that Black people believed in terms of what they were or who they are, was defined as evil, as bad. So it's about exhuming that knowledge, right? Analyzing it, talking about it, and understanding that it was not evil, it was not primitive, and whatever labels it was given, right? That the same way that we think it's okay as Christians when we celebrate All Saints Day or All Souls Day, when we talk about souls that are dearly departed, and we honor them and we pray. When Africans went and prayed and talked about their ancestors, why was that so different from this, right? So it's really a recognition that there's the damage that has been done. And I don't want to make it sound like Black people are sitting and wallowing in self-pity. They're not. They have overcome in spite of. And now this next phase of the journey is a journey that requires that mutual accountability so that we can work together, right? Otherwise, what value does Christianity have if we can't find that meeting of minds and hearts? Like somebody said, and I don't know who they are, but like somebody said, if we can't fix it now and live together now, how is it going to be like in heaven? Because, guess what? There'll be white people in heaven, there'll be Black people in heaven. I certainly hope that I'll be there, right? So let's, being on earth together, this is why we do the rehearsals.
Thank you. But Stephen Rotherford, could Amanda please comment on the view that the entry of the tribes of Israel escaping from slavery into Palestine was colonization? What lessons to learn from Israel's history in the Bible? What lessons are there to learn from Israel's history in the Bible?
That's a really, really sensitive question, Stephen, that you're asking me. I might choose not to go there in this lecture, if it's okay with you. I think that the only thing that I would say is that that particular question is so sensitive. I think the church has been silent when this conversation is going on in this country, right? But it is a conversation that on a one-to-one I would be happy to have.
I think that's really fair. Thank you so much for your honesty there. Okay, so we'll move on. So someone from Clapham Baptist Church says, what does dismantling the systems of oppression actually look like? All I have ever witnessed is reform, never dismantling.
Yes. What does it look like? So I think to dismantle something, we probably need to see what it looks like first. We have economic systems. I mean, let's give an example of the Bretton Woods institutions, so the World Bank and the IMF. And we know, for example, the governance of the World Bank and how the leadership of the World Bank is elected or chosen, right? And it is always the same system in that we always end up with somebody who is from one of, we always end up with either from the US or from Europe. Between the World Bank and IMF, it is shared between those powers, right? So actually, it's not really transparent. It is not really based on global meritocracy. It is a system, though, that manages global resources. It's a very powerful system that holds millions and millions that can make a difference to people's lives, right? And yet, if you are from a developing country, you will never have, at the moment, the way the system is, you will never really be at the helm, at least not if you're a Black person from these countries. That's a system that can be dismantled. We can choose to change that. We can choose to come up with a system that means that there can be competition with no threat that if somebody from a poor country heads the bank or the IMF, then all the rich countries are going to put their hands off and say, and take the money away, right? So there are very specific financial systems that we have. Taxation, who makes the rules on taxation? Because when we see, we've campaigned on tax justice, and what you see is rules of taxation that benefit only the rich countries, that benefits companies from the rich countries, right? If we changed that system of taxation to enable poorer countries to keep the revenue and income in their countries, hopefully, I say, they would be able to have more resources to use on basic things like health services, education, agriculture, and so on.
Thank you. So that leads kind of onto my next question here. It says, how can we make our voices heard about prioritizing Africa for vaccinations over boosters in wealthy nations?
I think that for those of us who live in the UK, we are privileged in that to a large extent, we can have voice. Yes, others have got a louder voice than Sam, but by and large, we have some voices, and some voices are heard, right? As the church, for example, right? I know that we're working with the churches very closely on issues of climate crisis and on issues of vaccine equity. There is something that we know is important for those that are in leadership positions in terms of our government. The power of the electorate, the power of people who vote, right? And so if the people who vote, the people who put you in office, rise up and tell you that they need you to change and to take a different action, that is very powerful indeed. And that can be done peacefully. It can be done through our existing systems, by talking to our members of parliament, as a church, by coming together as a collective and speaking out. Silence is a killer. Silence really is a killer. In the face of injustice, the church must never remain silent. We can come together, amplify our voices, and be able to say this is wrong. We have our own resources. How do we use those resources? So on the issue of vaccine inequity, my encouragement is to speak up and to speak up, to speak truth to our power structures, right? And also something that I think at times those that are in power have attempted to do is to pit those in this country against those elsewhere. And I think we should not fall into that trap, because it's not about either or. I think there are enough vaccines for us to have and for those in poorer countries to also have. And if both are taken care of, then actually it is a safer world. We'll be able to travel, we'll be able to interact, and our global supply chains will be back in action. But for as long as we think that we can only protect ourselves here and leave the rest of the world to suffer, right? At the end of the day, we are all suffering. And that's why I am saying that we are all in captivity, and we have to find a way to break free out of these, what I see as chains of unreasonableness and greed and selfishness, and a myopic view of the world, rather than a global collective view of humanity and the need for humanity to survive and to thrive.
Thank you. So, Centre for Baptist Studies, Oxford, you mentioned disrupting social norms until change comes. What kind of disruption do you think we should pursue?
I like to believe that I'm a peaceful person, you know. I also spent many years studying law, and so I always err on the side of the law for me. So my encouragement is that where we have channels that enable us to identify those norms and to disrupt those norms, we can do so through petitions, through standing for office, for example. You know, let's not stay away from offices, whether it's a councillor, whether it's a member of parliament, whatever it is. You know, if we want to see those changes, we have to do things differently. In schools, if we run education systems, for example, the church runs, how many schools does the church run, right? What is on your curriculum? What do you teach? I mean, it would be really interesting to see how many church schools actually have picked up on the issues that we've been talking about and talk about them and teach them and provide that awareness and knowledge to our young people through the education system, right? Pastors, vicars, I can't think of any other person in this country who has an audience every week of so many people, right? Do we talk about these things? Do we talk about identify behaviors that are not right, right? Do we identify practices in our communities, in our church communities, that we can see that these practices actually are detrimental to a just world and to the way that God would have us live with one another? How do we disrupt that? Do we talk about it? So I think there are many ways. And I think it's important for us not to think that, you know, there's only one way of disrupting these norms. And because otherwise, not everybody will be able to get there. So not everybody can go on a peaceful demonstration. Not everybody can write letters. But in our different spaces and platforms that we're given, in each one of those spaces, let us not remain silent. That way, the disruption of current norms and the creation of new norms and practices, let us model the behaviors that we want to see, right? So it's not just about talking, it's about us as Christians living out the experiences and the life that Jesus would have us live in our day-to-day lives, right? And that is what is going to change. But change is not going to come easy. It's not going to come fast. And so we must persevere and continuously do what we believe is right.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on what you said in your main lecture and also just now about churches. And I believe and understand you're speaking to all different types of churches. But I'd actually like to focus on the Black church for a moment. We know historically that many Black churches have been known or come to be known as houses of social justice, doing lots of social programs, being homes of safety. But as the decades have rolled on, we're seeing either a refusal or just a struggle to engage politically with these social issues. Can you speak more about what this unquenchable thirst, or the framing that focuses on accessing unlimited resources, how does that reinforce the struggle, and what does that look like in the Black church setting?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I come from, I'm a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I think our church has struggled, for example, with the conversation around the climate crisis. So I can't speak sweepingly on the whole church. But one of the things that I've had to say is that if we go back as a people of faith, as believers, to creation, I always say to my colleagues that when God created the world and everything in it, it's striking that he talks about and it was good, and he created and it was good, and it was good, and it was good. And then he told Adam and Eve, he put them in the garden to tend the garden. Now, yes, maybe English is not my first language, but when I think of what it means to tend the garden, it is to look after it lovingly and with care, right? It is about ensuring that everything that God has placed in that garden is able to thrive, to eat well, moderately, to live well, to live in harmony. Now, that sounds idealistic, but actually, when God asked us to tend the garden, it was because he knew it was possible. Otherwise, he wouldn't have asked it of us, right? Instead, what we have done is we've exploited that, right? So surely, as Black majority churches, right, we cannot run away from that instruction in creation to tend the garden. What we must now do is to really say to ourselves, what does it mean to tend the garden? Because at times what I hear from some of our churches is, well, God is going to destroy the world anyway, So it's part of that, right? And what I say is no, we should not help in the destruction of the world, right? But instead, we should do what we have been instructed and commanded to do, which is to tend the garden, right? The prophet Micah says to us, he has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. right? To do justly, what does that mean, right? This is not just about looking after ourselves as a small circle. And actually, Christian Aid did a survey a few months back and found that, contrary to what I think people think, Black majority churches, Black Christians, want to connect with the conversation around climate change, right? They understand the impact that it is having, maybe not here immediately, but most of them have got connections. Most Black people in the diaspora have got connections with relatives. So they're already hearing and seeing the consequences of the climate crisis on their families, on their friends, on their home, on the second homes. Yeah, I think that we need to engage with it. I think we can't just drink from our own cistern and just stay excluded. I think we engage with the conversation because actually the knowledge and understanding that we have is really important for that global solution.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much. So this is going to be our last question for the night. And this is from Tim Jackson. It says, is new government department of levelling up an opportunity the church must take to engage with or challenge the government to address issues covered tonight? How best to start this engagement?
Let's knock at the door. It's not a flippant response on my part, team. I think I am somebody that likes to look at opportunities. I also think that you give others the benefit of doubt, right? So let's ask to get involved. Let's look at what does that strategy look like for leveling up, and how do we contribute to that strategy, to that plan of leveling up? How are they going to level up in education? So for me today, my whole talk was really about the opportunities that we need, right? So I would ask that question: how is this plan for leveling up going to create those opportunities, right? I was really frustrated. I don't know if you remember when there was something on the news a few months back that the oximeters, you remember when COVID started last year and everybody was talking about oxygen levels, and we all went out and bought these oximeters. And then we were told that actually they were not tested on Black people. So when, as a Black person, you use it, it gives you false readings. And I was actually quite angry, right? And I thought, how many Black people all around the world have bought these oximeters? Just how much money have private companies made out of these oximeters? So if we're going to talk about leveling up, the plan cannot be, it should not be racialized. And if it's not going to be racialized, then it must be looked at from a racial lens in this country. We must ask the question of the issue of race. We must ask the question of the issue of gender. We must say, how is this plan tackling those issues of inequality, right, and injustice? And yes, let's use that as an opportunity. Let's use also the issue of the policing system, as an opportunity, because it's very, we could stay angry, but I say let's turn that anger into a very determined dialogue with the police institutions and challenge them on their plan, on their process, on how they work, and the experience of Black people, right? So yeah, and I think those opportunities exist both at the country level here, but also when we think about global Blackness, right? Because all these parts are all joined up together. And yes, we need to tackle them bit by bit. But I think we need to see the whole picture and then act local. So absolutely, Tim, let's use this as an opportunity.
Thank you, Amanda. Just such a huge thank you for your contribution, your lecture, the answers that you've given. You've covered such a breadth of fields and topics, and still yet grounded them in the important biblical principles that gather us here today, most of us here today as well. I really appreciate how you've also been able to lay out some clear points of action and strategy to help people get on their way, to be involved, and not just things to sit and think about. We're beyond, in many ways, beyond conversation on some things, and it's the time to just get on, knock at the door, as you said. And I feel that you've really inspired us today to do that and encouraged us, and also created an atmosphere of solemnity as we remember the suffering that has been and that continues and that drives us to continue to seek justice and racial equality. So thank you so much. I'd like to
thank you
bring
very
on,
much for having me.
You're most welcome. I'd like to bring on Rosemarie Davidson-Gotobed, who's going to wrap up our evening for us. Thank you so much for your questions and your comments as well tonight. They've been very stimulating, some challenging, and some very illuminating as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Eleasah. And as founder of these Sam Sharpe Lectures, celebrating its 9th consecutive year, it falls to me to lead the vote of thanks. Obviously, a huge thank you to Amanda for educating, stimulating, and challenging us in such a powerful way. We are always so blessed to have Amanda in our midst and to hear what she has to say to us as individuals and as a nation. And I'm sure we will all be talking about this long after this evening through social media, and maybe even when you get an opportunity, watch it again via the YouTube channel. Would also like to say thank you to the parliamentary team and for hosting us tonight. It's an honour to work with you, and also for Christian Aid for their support of this evening. We do these lectures every year, and there's a lot that goes on in the background. And I would like to take this opportunity to say a special thanks to the Reverend Wale Hudson Roberts. Year in and year out, Wale has taken upon himself and the personal time to put together the infrastructure for these lectures. He has done so in this lecture. It took him just over 3 years to do the meetings, the conversations, the endless emails, just in order that this evening will actually come to its fruition. I could not do this without him, and he represents the Baptist Union in such an incredible way. And we should all if you get an opportunity, if you know his email, flood his email box with his thank yous for the work that he does in the background. And I'd like to thank each and every one of you for attending, for engaging, for bringing your intellect, for listening. And it is my sincere hope that we will have the pleasure of welcoming you to the 10th anniversary of the Sam Sharpe Lectures next year, where our person who delivering our lecture would be Professor Kahindi Andrews. And you are going to be in for another evening of stimulation and challenge. We aim to make sure that people who walk with us walk with knowledge and are stretched and opened up as they move forward. So having said all of that, it is for me to say to you a good night. Thank you again for joining us. Please if you get a chance, listen to or watch the lecture again and continue this conversation, and can think about the ways that you could actually put into practice some of the things that we've been talking about this evening, either individually or collectively. What can you engage with in your private conversations with your friends and family? What have we heard today that you can infuse with your sermons and projects that you put on? The way that you engage with your school or your communities where you live. It is my hope that by this Black History Month next year, you will be a very different person doing amazing things than you did this year. Good night and thank you.